Welcome to another edition of Lion of Prophecy Television. Your host, Brandon Gallups and Carl Gallups. So glad that you've tuned in. You know, Brandon, there's a lot of talk in mainstream media from world leaders about, I'm just going to call it the spirit of World War III.
Yeah.
And that term World War III shakes people up when you speak of it because nobody wants a World War III. But two things about that. Number one, that terminology is what's being used by world leaders, international leaders. The Pope has said that he believes World War III has already started. Several other national leaders have said that. Vladimir Putin has said that or near about that on several occasions, and he has also warned that if certain things didn't change or if certain things happened, that it would be the cause of World War III.
That's right.
Some of China's leaders have said the same thing. Of course, you know, prophecy prognosticators and preachers are using that terminology as well. But ambassadors to the United Nations and various diplomats of international relations, they are speaking of the spirit of World War. Well, they're not using the term spirit. That's my terminology. But they're speaking about the World War III flavor of today's geopolitical wrangling. So here we are. Now, the second part, I said there are two things. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Word of God does not use the terminology World War III.
Right.
But the Word of God, most scholars agree, does speak that in the days, sometime before the return of the Lord, it will be marked by a World War spirit, a spirit of world wars, if you will. I guess the most striking example of that is what Jesus said in Matthew 24.
That's right.
Wars and rumors of wars, but then it goes on to say nations against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. I mean, he wouldn't use the terminology world war because the first one wouldn't occur for 2,000 more years.
Right.
But he's speaking of nations and kingdoms, nations against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. And he talks about these are the beginning of birth pangs. And so people sometimes look at all that and say, well, what he's saying is that these things have always happened and they'll always happen right up to the end. No, that's not what he's saying. He is speaking, he's answering questions about the last days. That's what his disciples asked. And then the beginning of birth pangs. I mean, ask any woman who's ever delivered a child what that means. When the contractions start coming, when the birth signals start coming, you don't look at your wife and say, oh, well, we got a long time, don't worry about it. No, that means it's getting very, very close. You know, it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. And that's what Jesus said in context. Now, you can deal with Ezekiel 38 and this multinational war in the Middle East that comes against Israel. You can deal with, was it Psalm 83, I think?
Psalm 83.
That speaks of a multinational war that comes against Israel. A lot of people relate Ezekiel 38 and Psalm 83 together, perhaps. You can look at the sixth trumpet in Revelation chapter 9, a huge multinational war in the Middle East. And there are other passages that seem to allude to this. The bottom line is, Brandon, and I'm going to say this and then let you give your commentary, but I think, and a lot of Bible scholars believe, that the Bible is clear that before the return of the Lord, and we're not saying if it's before the rapture or after the rapture,
right,
or before the tribulation, after, during the middle of the tribulation. We're not really concerned about an eschatological graph right now. What we're saying is, and I'll let you speak for yourself, but you and I talk about this a lot. We believe that we're the generation that's watching the build-up to that. And even international leaders are using the terminology. And they're not even referring to the Bible, but they're using the terminology that's in the Bible.
Right. No, and I would definitely agree. And especially if you look at where the focus of war is today.
Yes.
It's centered right now,
yes,
today, when we're sitting here in this studio in Syria.
Right.
It's where it's all. Now, there are other nations that are involved. Of course, Russia, China, North Korea,
Turkey.
That's right. Persia, Iran, Turkey. But, like I say, North Korea,
Israel.
North Korea, not even part of the Middle East. They're doing their thing and saber rattling all the time. But if you look at the focus of where all this comes together, It's in the Middle East.
Yes.
So we have to pay attention because every major world war that seems to point to the end times in the Bible is focused where?
Yes.
In the Middle East.
In the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's focused against a returned Israel.
A returned Israel. That's exactly
And
right.
we're the first
Especially
generation
Psalm
history to see it.
83,
Yeah.
Ezekiel 38. Those two are specifically say these nations come together for the purpose of one thing, to destroy Israel.
And when you look at all those nations in the Bible, now in our day, every one of them are Islamic.
Yeah.
But of course, Islam wasn't even invented when Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38 were written. But yet, these are the nations, these are the armies that will be commanded by the Antichrist. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think it's also important to look back at what you said about the words of Jesus and, how people will point and say, well, there have always been wars.
Yes.
But the reality is, just within the last 100 years, roughly, is the first time in human history when we have seen a series of world wars,
Right.
where literally the whole world got involved on in some scale or another.
Right.
World War I obviously started in 1913. World War II, which led to the return to Israel.
Right.
And so now here we're sitting just 100 years roughly past the beginning of World War I, and now we're already potentially looking at a World War III scenario.
Right.
Again, focused in the Middle East, dragging all of these nations together. The words of Ezekiel 38, I will hook them by their jaws and drag them into war.
Right.
All of these nations being drugged to war
Right.
in the Middle East
Right.
at this time.
Right. Yeah, and when you think about, you're talking about the world wars, and I have often described it like this: we're the first generation in history that we can literally call ourselves the generation of world wars.
That's right.
Because prior to 1914, 13, 14, and 15, 16, 17, and 18, in those years when World War I was commencing, but it's officially, the official commencement of World War I is 1914, but if you read the history on that, it took decades
To build up to it. That's right.
Some historians say 40 years of geopolitical wranglings and intrigue and things that were happening, that were fomenting and building and fanning the flames until boom, 1914, that World War I, the Great War, is now being fought, is what they called it. The war to end all wars. How funny.
right.
That's what they said, the war to end all wars. As a matter of fact, not only did it not end all wars, but it actually was the spark, the catalyst that began World War II. World War II was just a continuation of World War I,
right.
largely because of what happened to Germany in World War I, and then them coming back on the heels of a Hitler, this national figure that promised to save them and to make them the superpower of the world, and everybody rallied around him. And the next thing you know, you have the Holocaust and World War II and the invasion of Poland and other other nations, and so these things they're all tied together. And if we are in the edges of a World War III scenario, the Scripture, as you said, speaks of this great war in the last days, but it seems to have a different flavor than World War I and World War II. It is kingdoms against kingdoms and nations against nations, and Revelation, if it's meant literal, Revelation, the sixth trumpet that speaks of this, 200 million people fighting each other in the Middle East on the Euphrates River.
Yeah.
And there's something very spiritual about it, because there's angels that have been held up back for this year, this month, this day, this hour. So there's something, it's in God's timing, it's very spiritual, it's spiritually connected, it's in the Middle East. Obviously, it's tied to now Islam somehow. It's aimed against Israel. And again, people say, well, that's after the rapture. It doesn't matter. The point is, it's got to build. It's got to come from somewhere. And we're the first generation now to see an Arab Spring, the collapse of Syria, Egypt and Libya tossed and turned in turmoil, Israel surrounded by enemies, Turkey falling into an Islamic caliphate. Russia shows up in the Middle East with its military troops. They plant themselves in Syria, Isaiah 17, the fall of Damascus in the last days. Then China builds its first international military base, Northeast Africa, so that it can supply troops into the Middle East, and they give thousands of troops to Russia in a
right.
compact with Russia in Syria. So now China's in Syria. China's in the Middle East with its military. Russia's in the Middle East and its military. They're both located in Syria. Russia is in strong accord with Persia now,
That's
Iran.
right.
Russia may be, if not Magog, at least a big chunk of it. Some people think Turkey may be a part of Magog as well as some of the Stan nations. I mean, you know, the prophets were not concerned with national names because borders and change all the time, but they were dealing with tribal names and regions and areas. Our map has those regions and areas and tribal into like Turkey and Russia and Afghanistan, and, you know. So Magog could be a conglomeration of all that rather than just like one specific nation. But you got Russia, who's kind of been the centerpiece of that Magog understanding for a long time, 100 years or more.
That's right.
From biblical commentators and scholars, now in compact with Persia.
That's right.
We call it Iran, but in the 1930s it was called Persia. Every map of the world showed Persia. And so there, and Ezekiel 38, 2,600 years ago said that
was going to
Magog's going to join with Persia.
Right.
And then you're going to have other nations connected to it.
And look at what caused that to happen. The rise of ISIS.
Yeah. Arab Spring.
Out of Islam.
Right.
Is what caused all that to happen. And we already, you know, I referenced North Korea. Okay. North Korea, it's not a Middle Eastern country, obviously, but it is directly tied to several of the nations that we just mentioned. And China being the biggest, their largest supporter and contributor, financial backer. So let's just say, for instance, if the United States were to go to war with North Korea, China's got to make a decision.
Yes.
And like you said, China is already allied with Russia in the Middle East. We're in the Middle East.
Right.
So how
Russia's not too tight.
So how does that play out? Yeah, no, exactly.
Iran's not tight.
Right. We're not. I'm not making a prediction on how to play out. We don't know.
Right.
But we do see that even a country that's not even directly tied to the Middle East is directly tied to the Middle East.
Right. And as we're making this particular episode, Donald Trump is president.
That's right.
He is a huge supporter of Israel at the time we're making this episode. Well, that doesn't bode well with Iran.
No.
I can't help but to believe it probably doesn't bode well with Russia then.
That's right.
I can't help but to believe it probably doesn't bode well with the leaders of China, communist atheist nation. Here's the center of religion in the world: Christianity, Judaism, and a Muslim center, Israel. So you make all those connections, plus the New York Times made this connection, and I documented it, and I've been speaking to this for years, that everywhere where we are now is all tied back to Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait.
Yeah.
The New York Times made that connection. The only reason I keep saying that is not like there's some final authority. It's just that they're so secular and so leftist, they don't even realize the biblical connections they're making. But the connection they made is that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, which brought a multinational Western coalition led by the United States into the Middle East. We squelched Saddam Hussein and the Gulf War, which infuriated Osama bin Laden and those radical sect of Islam. 10 years later, a decade later, they invade the United States, if you will. 9/11, September the 11th, 2001 occurs. What happens then? That infuriates the United States. We send troops and bombs and Moab bombs into Afghanistan and to Iraq and Baghdad and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and all of that happens. And then we stay there for a decade and a half or more.
Right.
And then finally a presidential election is held and a man comes to power in the United States called Barack Hussein Obama, who is an instigator along with Hillary Clinton and a supporter of Arab Spring. And for those that doubt they were instigators, again, the New York Times, when it all broke out, reported that they were and praised them for it. Because by the liberals, it was seen as a good thing. And Egypt collapses and Libya collapses into war. And the next thing you know, Syria breaks out into an irrecoverable civil war. We're still right in the midst of it now. Turkey begins to rise as an Islamic caliphate. Russia comes in. ISIS is born. China comes in. Russia and Iran. The United States and the Iranian nuclear deal. I mean, this is amazing.
You know, it is.
And now as we're making this, North Korea is in the headline news. And people say, well, how are they connected to the Middle East? Because North Korea and China have been glued together at the hip for decades, all the way back to the Korean War and before.
That's right.
Because China supplied North Korea with troops, military armament and hardware, and economic aid during the Korean War against us.
That's right.
And to this day, China has an embassy in North Korea. North Korea has an embassy in China. Yeah. And it's only been in the last couple of years that China's relationship with North Korea has been getting a little shaky, and the current President Donald Trump is trying to capitalize on that right now. But right now, we're still in the midst of this building and fomenting, and this is how world wars are started. And we're the first generation to see World War I. And I say generation, 100 years is a length of an entire generation where everybody basically has died out. But here we are within 100 years, 6,000 to 10,000 years of human history. There's only been one historical generation that has seen World War I, World War II, and now the edges of World War III.
Right.
I think that's very prophetic, Brandon. We've got to wrap it up, but what do you think?
No, I agree 100%. And like you said, bottom line is multiple passages in the Bible point to a major world war in the last days. And so the question is that what we're watching build right now? Right. And we'll just have to keep our eyes tuned to see. Right. But something is happening on the world stage.
I cannot help but to believe that this is the buildup to it.
Absolutely.
I'm not a warmonger. I don't set dates. I'm not trying to say, everybody run for cover. This is World War III. I'm just saying, how can this not be the buildup to what the Bible prophesies?
In the Middle East.
How can it not be?
Yeah.
We're living in extremely prophetic times. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Stand in this word. Stand in faith. We are ambassadors for the kingdom of Jesus Christ until He comes again. This is our day. This is our time. God has raised you up for such a time as this.
Yes.
May the Lord bless you and keep you, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of Lion of Prophecy Television.